Hey friends, tonight we begin with what night was really like in Victorian London. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me now in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The day in Victorian London always seemed to end before it truly wished to. In summer, the sun sank reluctantly, spilling its last light along the crooked chimneys and roof lines, painting the soot-stained bricks with a brief glow that almost made them look warm. In winter, darkness arrived abruptly, with barely an hour between the last bite of daylight and the cold shroud of night. But no matter the season, the transition was never gentle. The city did not fade quietly from day into night. It shifted, like a great, restless animal curling in on itself, the muscles of commerce and industry relaxing even as the pulse of something different began to beat. In the late afternoon, the great markets began their winding down. Covent Garden, which had roared with the voices of traders since dawn, grew quieter as barrows were pushed away and baskets of unsold flowers drooped under their own weight. Porters in rough coats shouldered crates of fruit, the last deliveries of the day going to restaurants and the better townhouses in Mayfair. In the East End, the costermongers, those rough but lively street sellers, gathered up the remains of their day's trade. Bruised apples, wilting greens, fish, laid out on slabs of melting ice, their shouts once sharp enough to cut through. The noise of cartwheels and boot heels grew softer, the calls now aimed at the few late buyers hoping for a bargain. A few streets away, in quieter squares where the air seemed marginally cleaner, the first lamplighters appeared. They came in worn coats and carried long poles tipped with a small flame, moving from post to post with slow, practiced gestures. Each lamp flared weakly before settling into its amber glow, casting small circles of warmth into the deepening gloom. These men were unhurried. The city was large, and the night would wait for them. They worked in the faint scent of oil and soot, their shadows long and stretched thin across the cobbles. The lamplighters were a sign for some that the day was truly over, a signal for shopkeepers to close their shutters and clerks to step out into the chill air for the walk home down by the river. The Thames had already turned dark. Its surface reflected the last scraps of daylight in broken silver streaks, disturbed by the slow churn of barges heading toward the docks. The water was never still. Even in the calm of evening, it moved with an undercurrent of industry. The smell along the embankments was a potent mix: salt, mud, coal smoke, and something faintly metallic. Men in heavy coats lingered near the warehouses, smoking pipes and talking in low voices as they watched the traffic on the river. Here, night came first, the sun dropping below the ragged silhouette of cranes and masts, leaving the banks in shadow long before the streets above felt the loss of light in the working-class districts. The approach of night was marked not by stillness, but by a change in sound. The sharp clang of factory bells had faded, replaced by the clatter of boots on narrow pavements. Men poured out of workshops, their shoulders stooped and faces blackened with soot or streaked with oil. Children darted ahead, weaving between the legs of horses and carts, their shouts high and wild. Women stood in doorways, arms folded, waiting for husbands, sons, or brothers to return. The air was thick with the smell of boiling cabbage, coal, fires, and damp wall. The West End, by contrast, grew more animated. Carriages began to appear in greater numbers, their polished black sides gleaming in the lamplight. Footmen in livery adjusted their gloves and held open doors for ladies in silk dresses and men in evening coats. Theatre billboards, lit by flickering gaslight, promised music hall entertainments, melodramas, and comic operas. The clink of coins in ticket sellers' hands carried down the street, mingling with the sharp hiss of gas as lamps above theatre doors burned brighter. But beneath all this movement, there was a subtle shift, a gathering quiet that was not silence, but something more watchful. The city was not asleep, not yet, but it was folding away its daylight self, tucking it into corners for safekeeping. There was an unspoken understanding that the night belonged to other forces, some familiar, some far less so. You could feel it in the way footsteps changed tempo, in the way strangers' eyes met briefly before looking away. You could sense it in the pause between one market call and the next. In the creak of a closing door, the sun slipped lower, the sky over the rooftops turning the color of bruised violets. A breeze came up from the river, carrying with it the promise of fog. It would not be the dense, choking pea souper that London dreaded, not tonight, but just enough to soften the edges of the lamps and make the streets look older than they already were. The first stars were faint against the lingering glow, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell told the hour. Night was coming, and London, with all its crowded rooms, narrow alleys, glittering halls, and shadowed doorways, was ready to receive it. Twilight in Victorian London was never purely a matter of light fading. It was a transformation that touched every sense. The fading gold along the rooftops slipped into dull grey, and the air seemed to thicken, as though the city itself were pulling a shawl over its shoulders. The narrow streets between tall brick buildings darkened quickly, their upper windows catching the last embers of the sky while the pavements below sank into shadow. Gas lamps along the main thoroughfares glowed brighter against the deepening dusk, but their reach was limited. The light stopped short at alley mouths, leaving the narrow passages in near blackness. The rattle of hansom cabs over cobblestones became sharper in the cooler air. Drivers, hunched in greatcoats, urged their horses to a quicker pace, eager to deliver their passengers before the first real chill of evening settled in. Their wheels splashed through puddles left from the mornings. Rain and the smell of wet leather rose from the horses' harnesses. Passengers stepped out beneath the lamps, brushing away droplets from their coats or skirts, their faces half lit and half hidden in the yellow glow. Along the main streets, shop windows still held some light. Milliners' displays showed hats, perched like quiet sentinels on velvet stands, their feathers frozen mid. Bakers' shelves, once stacked high, were now half empty, a few loaves resting beside the day's last sweet buns. The glass steamed faintly from the heat within, and the scent of bread drifted out each time the door opened. Beside them, tobacconists kept their counters open for men stopping in after work, the rich, sweet smell of pipe tobacco mingling with the sharper temps of matched smoke as customers lit their first evening pipes. On street corners, chestnut vendors did brisk trade. Their small braziers glowed like pockets of fire in the gathering gloom, the shells cracking and releasing a warm, nutty aroma that spread in every direction. Customers cupped their hands over the paper twists of roasted nuts, letting the heat seep into their fingers before they began to eat. The hiss of chestnut splitting was a soft counterpoint to the louder sounds, the iron-shod hooves striking stone, the creak of wagon axles, the distant clang of a dockside bell. In the poorer districts, the evening fog settled earlier. The combination of coal smoke from countless hearths and the damp from the Thames rolled into the streets in slow-moving clouds. It softened the outlines of buildings and made lamps look like moons seen through frosted glass. Children darted in and out of the mist, their laughter momentarily muffled before they burst into clarity again. Mothers called them inside, their voices half swallowed by the fog, while men lingered outside public houses, their silhouettes blurred. Catching the light, there was a rhythm to these final hours before night took full hold. In the West End, doormen in heavy coats opened the polished brass doors of restaurants and supper clubs, ushering in guests with a practiced bow. Ladies in silks and gloves passed under gas lamps that caught the shimmer of beadwork and the deep sheen of velvet. Gentlemen removed their hats before stepping inside, the sense of cigar smoke and brandy drifting out as the door swung open. In these districts, the night was a stage, and each arrival was an entrance. In the East End, the same hour was marked by a different sort of gathering. Market stalls that had closed hours earlier gave way to street hawkers selling late night. Fair hot pies from handcarts, mugs of steaming coffee, and small plates of oysters eaten with vinegar from chipped enamel dishes. The air was filled with the cries of sellers advertising their wares, the flicker of their small oil lamps reflecting off tin trays and battered kettles. In some corners, the sounds were sharper, the slap of cards on a table in a back room, the muted cheer of a winning hand, as the last band of daylight drained from the sky. London's skyline became a jagged cutout against a deepening indigo. Chimney pots stood like rows of sentries, their silhouettes softened by the faint haze of smoke still drifting upward. Church towers rose above the rooftops, their bells chiming the quarter hours. Each chime carried further now, the sound traveling through the colder air with a clarity that made it seem both nearer and more solitary, dotted by the river. The fog had thickened into a low, rolling blanket. Bargemen worked in near silence, their shouts to one another dampened by the mist. The lights from warehouses became blurred patches, their reflections trembling on the black surface of the water. Somewhere unseen, a dog barked, the sound thin, and far away, a watchman's lantern bobbed along the embankment, the pool of its light catching the slick wetness of the stones. The city, in this moment between day and night, held a peculiar kind of beauty, not the bright beauty of a clear morning or a sunlit park, but something quieter, more secretive. It was as if London was taking a deep breath before stepping into its other life, the one that could only exist under the cover of darkness. The last gasps of daylight faded, and with them went the day's last illusions of safety and order. Night was coming, and the city, vast, restless, and unblinking, was ready. Inside the houses of London, the fading light brought a slow rearranging of life. Curtains were drawn, shutting out the street, and the glow of the gas lamps outside became a pale echo against the heavier warmth within. Windows and work terraces showed squares of light against the darkness, some wavering with the flicker of oil lamps, others steady with the more expensive glow of gas. The glass was often fogged from the heat of cooking, the outlines of people inside softened by the thin veil of condensation. In middle-class parlors, the evening meal was the anchor of the household. Families gathered around tables, spread with dishes of mutton or beef, potatoes, and puddings heavy with suet. A servant might bring in the plates, her face flushed from the kitchen's heat, setting them down with the quiet efficiency expected. Of her station, the clink of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation filled the rooms, punctuated by the occasional creak of a chair or the rattle of a spoon against a teacup. Outside, the muffled clop of a passing carriage served as a reminder that beyond the curtained windows, the city went on in humbler homes. Suppers were simpler, but no less important. The smell of boiling cabbage and onions hung in the air, mingling with the sharper scent of coal smoke. Bread was sliced thick, butter spread with the edge of a knife worn thin from years of use. Some households made do with broth ladled from a single pot, steam curling into the low-ceilinged rooms. Children huddled near the fire, their hands outstretched toward the heat, listening to the quiet rhythm of their parents' talk or the scratch of a chair leg on the flagstones. Upstairs, in rented rooms, above shops, solitary lodgers ate alone. A plate of bread and cheese, perhaps, or a small pie bought from a street vendor earlier in the day. The sound of life from below drifted upward, the closing of shutters, the thud of a shop door being locked, while beyond the thin walls came the distant strains of a piano from another room. The music was imperfect, the notes sometimes faltering, but in the stillness it took on a strange intimacy, as though meant for no ears but yours. In wealthier homes, servants moved quietly about their duties. Parlors were made ready for the evenings. Callers, fires stoked until the flames danced high, the brass fender polished until it caught the light. A decanter of sherry might be set out beside a pair of glasses, ready for the master of the house to receive a guest or two. Upstairs, in bedrooms warmed by glowing coals, ladies changed from day dresses into gowns fit for an evening of cards or theatre. Their maids moved deftly, fastening hooks, smoothing skirts, and adjusting lace collars with hands that had done the same work countless times before. For many, the drawing of the curtains was more than a matter of keeping out the cold. It was a barrier against the uncertain life of the streets after dark. Once the outside was shut away, the world seemed smaller, defined by the edges of the room, the reach of the lamplight, the quiet companionship of those within. In this glow, one could forget the fog drifting along the gutters, the sound of boots on wet pavement, the occasional cry from far away that no one wished to explain. Not every home was a place of ease. In the overcrowded rookeries, where families lived in single rooms, privacy was impossible. Curtains, if they existed, were thin as muslin, and the fire, if there was one, had to be coaxed from a few sticks or scraps of coal. The air was thick, with the smell of damp and the sound of neighbors living their lives only a few feet away. Arguments, coughing fits, babies crying. Yet even here, night brought a kind of pause, the day's labors finished, the hours ahead given over to whatever rest could be found. On quieter streets, the passing of a lamplighter or the slow tread of a watchman marked the hours. His lantern would cast a brief flare against a wall, then vanish as he turned the corner, leaving the street to the muffled sounds of its inhabitants. Occasionally, the faint strains of music would drift from a public house, the door swinging open just long enough for the laughter inside to spill out into the cold before being shut. Away again, the act of closing doors and drawing curtains was the city's collective breath inward. It was the moment when the private world took precedence over the public one, when families, couples, and solitary souls alike withdrew into their own pools of light, letting the darkness have the streets. Outside, London belonged to those who'd worked or wandered at night. Inside, the hours ahead stretched in their own quiet rhythm, the turning of pages in a book, the slow embers in a hearth, the steady breathing of someone asleep in the next room. When the last of the supper plates had been cleared and the fires banked low, the sounds of London changed again. The voices that had filled the streets earlier in the evening grew scarce, replaced by the occasional murmur that carried across. The cobbles, the city, did not fall silent entirely. London never did, but it took on a quieter register, a kind of watchful stillness that made every sound distinct. Boots echoed more sharply now. The measured tread of the night watchman could be heard long before he came into view, his pace steady and unhurried. He carried a staff and a lantern, the flame inside bobbing with each step, casting brief halos of light that retreated as quickly. As they appeared, his coat, heavy and buttoned to the neck, caught the gleam of the lamps above him, the brass buttons dulled by years of service. From time to time, he would pause to test a door, giving the handle a firm shake to ensure it was locked, or to glance down an alley where the shadows pulled thick. The watchmen were not alone in the streets. In wealthier districts, the occasional carriage rattled past, its windows curtained, the sound of the horses' hooves softened by the mist. A footman might stand on the step at the rear, his gloved hands resting lightly on the rail, his eyes scanning the dim-lit facades for the right house. In poorer quarters, movement was harder to see, but easier to sense. A figure slipping quickly into a side street, the rustle of a bundle being shifted from one shoulder to another, the faint, metallic clink of coins changing hands under cover of darkness. There was a peculiar intimacy to the city at this hour. Streets that had bustled with hundreds only hours before now lay empty, save for the glow of gas lamps reflecting off wet stone. The fog that had earlier drifted in from the river thickened in places, rising like pale smoke along the gutters. Lamps became small islands in the haze, their light haloed and uncertain. Every sound, the drip of water from an eave, the squeak of a cartwheel in the distance, the sharp bark of a dog seemed magnified in the stillness. For the watchmen, the city was a map they knew by instinct. They could walk their beats. In near darkness, guided by the familiar tilt of a roofline or the particular echo of footsteps on a certain stretch of cobblestone. Their task was as much to reassure as to deter, their presence a quiet signal that someone was watching. Still, there were parts of London where they walked with more caution, narrow alleys behind taverns, shadowed yards where the faint glow of a hidden pipe might be the only light, places where the fog seemed to settle thicker as though reluctant to be disturbed. From time to time, they would cross paths with each other. Lanterns would tilt in greeting, the brief exchange of words muffled by the mist, and then each man would vanish again into his own circuit. The rhythm of their steps became part of the night's fabric, as much a part of the city as the slow, heavy tolling of the church clocks marking each passing hour. In certain streets, the stillness could be almost unnerving. You might walk half a mile without seeing another living soul. The only signs of life, the faint glow from a half-shuttered window, or the warm breath of a horse standing in a stable yard. Then, without warning, a door would open to release a slice of light and the muted sound of laughter, only for both to be swallowed up again as the door shut. London's night was a layered thing. Above, the lamps and the slow patrols gave it shape and order. Beneath, in the unlit corners and behind closed shutters, it held countless small lives, the baker beginning his dough, the sick room where a nurse leaned over a sleeping child, the solitary man at his desk with only a candle for company. The watchman moved between these worlds, touching both but belonging wholly to neither dot. As the hours deepened, the pace of the streets slowed further still. The last stragglers found their way home, doors locked behind them, and the city settled into the long stretch before dawn. The watchmen's lanterns became the moving stars of this other London, marking time not by the sun but by the steady, deliberate sweep of their patrols. Night had fully claimed the city now. The breath London had been holding since sunset was released into the cold, mist-heavy air, and with it came the quiet understanding that the day's life had been put to rest. What remained belonged to the dark, and to those willing to walk its length. For the upper tiers of Victorian London society, night was not an ending but an opening act. Where the working class withdrew behind their drawn curtains, the wealthy stepped out into the darkness with purpose. Their evenings stitched together with invitations, obligations, and amusements that kept them from their beds until long after midnight. The streets of the West End were the setting for this other London. Gas lamps burned brighter here, polished glass chimneys cleaned daily so the glow would not be dimmed. By soot, the pavements were swept more often, and though the fog still drifted in from the Thames, it seemed softer in these districts, as though it had been invited for atmosphere rather than creeping in unbidden. Carriages lined the curbs outside the grand houses, their lamps shining gold in the mist, the steam from horses' breath curling into the night. The evening began in drawing rooms lit by chandeliers whose crystals caught the gaslight and scattered it in tiny stars across the ceiling. Here, guests removed their gloves and cloaks, revealing dresses of silk and satin, the sheen of the fabric shifting with each movement. Men's evening coats were cut close, their shirt fronts stiff with starch, their cravats tied with studied care. Conversations began in low tones, polite and restrained, before warming into something livelier as the sherry or champagne was poured. From such gatherings, the night could take many forms. Some guests left for the theatre, their carriages drawing. Up outside gilt-fronted playhouses, footmen opened doors onto pavements where ticket sellers called the hour and the performance soon to begin. Inside, the air was warm with the mingled scents of perfume, cigars, and the faint tang of gas. The orchestra tuned, the chatter of the audience rose and fell, and then the lights dimmed for the curtain's slow ascent. Elsewhere, the night led. 2 grand ballrooms, their floors polished to a gleam. Musicians set upon raised platforms where the sound of strings could carry across the sweep of dancers. The air shimmered with movement, skirts swaying, the gleam of jewels at throats and wrists, the crisp slide of gloves against silk. Conversations here were half social formality, half strategic alliance. A marriage proposal could begin with a dance and be sealed before the last guests left in the early hours. For others, the destination was quieter, the gentlemen's clubs. Along Pall Mall and St. James's Street, these houses, their facades discreet and unassuming, hid interiors of thick carpets, panelled walls, and deep leather chairs. Here, men spoke in low voices over newspapers, played long games of whist, or discussed politics by the fire. The clink of glasses from the bar mixed with the steady scratch of pens in the writing rooms, where letters were composed to be sent by morning post. Outside, a porter in a dark coat kept watch, greeting members by name and ensuring that the fog-shrouded street beyond the steps remained someone else's concern. Not all wealthy evenings were spent in public. In the privacy of dining rooms, lit by candelabra, small dinner parties unfolded over multiple courses, the plates carried in by liveried footmen and removed just as silently. The conversation flowed from theatre to politics to the latest gossip. From the court, the talk underpinned by the quiet ticking of the long case clock in the hall. After the final course, the ladies would withdraw to the drawing room while the men lingered over port and cigars. the smoke curling lazily upward into the shadows. Above the table, what marked these nights was their insulation from the harsher truths of the city beyond. The wealthy moved through London in warmed carriages, their feet rarely touching the damp cobbles. Their gaslit halls and mirrored rooms reflected back only what was meant to be seen: refinement, prosperity, the ordered glow of privilege. Yet even here, if you stepped to the window and looked beyond the lamplit street, you could just make out the darker outline of the city stretching away, waiting for them to return to their safe, curtained world before resuming its own nocturnal business start. In these hours, the velvet nights of the wealthy ran parallel to, but never touched, the lives unfolding in the dimmer quarters of London. The city was a single body, but its bloodstream carried entirely different currents, depending on where the gas lamps burned brightest. In the dimmer districts of London, the end of a day's work did not mean the streets fell silent. Here, the night could be as busy as the afternoon, though the bustle was different in tone. By day, the markets roared with voices and the clatter of trade. By night, the crowds thinned, but the commerce did not stop. It merely shifted into another register, one lit by smaller flames, and kept alive by those who could not afford to waste an hour's opportunity to sell in certain streets of the East End. Handcarts stood like islands of light in the darkness. Each was fitted with a small oil lamp or the glow of a brazier, and around them gathered knots of customers. Hot eels were a favorite, served from steaming pots, the pieces ladled into shallow dishes and sprinkled with vinegar. The smell was sharp and unmistakable, carried on the damp air along with the sizzle of the cooking liquor. A few streets away, pie sellers called out their offerings: mutton, beef, or potato-filled, wrapped in thick pastry that steamed as it was cut. Their cries, half sing and half shout, had a rhythm born from long repetition, each syllable shaped to carry over the straight's noise. The market stalls that lingered into the night offered what the day's trade had left. Barrows were piled with the bruised fruit and wilting vegetables that had not been sold earlier. Their prices dropped for quick sale. Fishmongers worked by the light of a single lamp swinging above their counter. The fish laid on beds of melting ice, the scales glinting faintly. The voices here were brisk and businesslike. Coins exchanged quickly so the next customer could be served before the heat from the lamps melted too much of the display. The smell of the night market was a mingled thing: the sharp tang of vinegar, the sweetness of roasting chestnuts, the earthy scent of damp produce, and the constant undertone of coal smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. In narrow lanes, coffee stalls did brisk business, selling hot mugs for a penny to cab drivers, costermongers, and anyone needing warmth before the long walk home. The steam rose in clouds from the cups, carrying with it the rich, bitter scent of the brew. Some added a splash of rum for courage against the cold. Children still darted between the stalls, their voices quick and bright, weaving between the skirts of their mothers or the boots of strangers. Some were sent on errands for bread or a handful of potatoes. Others were simply lingering, drawn to the warmth and light before being called in for the night. Dogs prowled the edges of the crowd, hoping for scraps, their shapes shifting in and out of the lamplight. There was a camaraderie in these late-hour markets. Stallholders called greetings to one another across the street, swapping bits of news or complaints about the weather. Bargaining was quick, but not unkind. A seller might slip an extra apple into a paper bag for an old customer, or a few more ladles of broth into the dish of someone who had only a penny to spend. The sense was not of plenty, but of squeezing the most from what little was left of the day. Beyond the stalls, the streets fed into other kinds of business. Public houses stood open, their doorways glowing yellow in the fog. The warmth and noise inside spilled briefly onto the street whenever the door swung open, revealing the clink of glasses and the rise and fall of voices. For some, the market was a prelude to a night's drinking. For others, it was the last stop before home. Yet even here, the edge of the city's darkness was never far. A shadow at the end of a lane, a face half hidden under a cap, a voice calling. Softly from a doorway, these were the reminders that the night market was as much a place of risk as of trade. A moment's distraction could mean a hand slipping into a pocket or a bundle vanishing from a cart. The sellers kept their eyes sharp, their hands close to their coins. Still, the market endured until the small hours, the lamps burning low, the stock growing sparse. One by one, the handcarts were wheeled away, the braziers doused, the last dishes of eels or pies sold to the final lingering customers. The street darkened as each stall shut down, the sounds fading until only the hollow echo of footsteps remained. In those final moments, the night seemed to reclaim the street entirely. The market's glow was gone, and in its place stretched a long, quiet road lined with shuttered windows. The only movement came from a stray cat slipping along a wall, its shadow stretching tall in the lamplight before vanishing into the dark. As the evening deepened over Victorian London, the long avenues and crooked lanes of the city entered a different rhythm, one that was neither fully wakeful nor entirely asleep. The gas lamps that lined the more prosperous districts glowed steadily, each mantled flame trembling slightly in the breath of the night air. Their light spread in amber halos on wet cobblestones, catching the gleam of carriage wheels and the boots of hurried passers-by. Yet beyond these safe circles, there remained swathes of darkness into which even the most adventurous hesitated to step. The homes of the middle classes kept, their curtains tightly drawn against the cold and the curiosity of the street. Behind them, parlor lamps cast warm silhouettes on floral drapes. Families gathered in drawing rooms, their evenings shaped by the rituals of tea, conversation, and perhaps a few chapters from a newly purchased serial novel. In these interiors, time moved gently, accompanied by the steady tick of a mantel clock and the occasional creak of furniture settling. Outside, the street offered a sharper tempo, boots striking stone, the metallic ring of hoof-shod horses, and the whistle of a constable cutting through the air as he signaled to a colleague on the next corner. Farther east, in the districts, where wages stretched thin and rent was a burden, the night possessed a different texture. The glow of gas lamps was less frequent, their posts spaced farther apart, leaving long tracts of unlit passage between them. Here, the windows of lodging houses were cracked open to the smell of coal smoke and the voices of the street. In narrow courts, women leaned on windowsills to trade words with neighbors, while children, not yet herded indoors, darted in games that ignored the chill. Life here did not pause politely for darkness. It adapted to it, mingling work and leisure in the same cramped space. On the riverside, the Thames carried the night with its own muted authority. Barges, loaded with goods or refuse, slipped between the wharves, their crews working under dim lanterns that made each figure a shadow among shadows. The water's surface mirrored the glow of bridge lamps in broken lines, trembling whenever a gust swept down from the docks. Somewhere upriver, the chime of a great clock marked the passage of the hour, its sound traveling in softened echoes that merged with the steady rush of the tide. Not all movement at night was visible. Inside, workshops where deadlines could not be delayed. Small knots of laborers continued their tasks long after other trades had closed. A seamstress bent over her work, candlelight brushing the curve of her hand as she stitched. A printer's apprentice swept metal shavings from the floor, while his master checked the alignment of plates for the morning run. The city's economy did not sleep, and for those whose livelihoods depended on its constant turning, neither did they. Yet even within industry's unrelenting pace, there were moments of stillness. A carter might pause to share a word with a watchman, leaning against his horse's flank for warmth. A sailor, fresh from a voyage, might stand on the dock, breathing in the cold air with a sense of being on solid ground for the first time in months. In such exchanges, brief as they were, there was a shared recognition of the night as both a boundary and a bridge separating the day that had been from the one yet to come. As midnight approached, the city's quieter undercurrents became more pronounced. The rattle of carriages diminished in the wealthier quarters, leaving only the steady clop of a solitary cab or the distant rumble of a late delivery cart. The flickering glow of a few upstairs lamps revealed that some households still kept to their books or correspondence. But these signs grew rarer with each passing quarter hour in the poorer districts. However, the night retained more of its noise. Pubs that had not yet shuttered spilled voices and the faint smell of ale into the street whenever their doors swung open. Groups of men and women lingered at corners, their conversation quickened by drink and the relief of being away from the day's work. Children who should have been asleep found excuses to remain outside, the shadows offering a certain freedom from the scrutiny of adults. The constables continued their rounds with unhurried steps, their presence a reminder of both order and watchfulness. Each officer carried a truncheon at his side, though it was the lantern in his hand that most often drew notice, casting a wandering circle of light that shifted with his stride. In the alleys, where his path might not extend, figures moved more cautiously, aware of both the dangers and the opportunities that came when the official gaze was elsewhere. The river remained a constant companion to the city's night. From the bridges, its breadth was a dark ribbon, broken by the dim outlines of moored vessels and the skeletal shapes of cranes along the docks. Occasional shouts drifted over the water from boat to shore, their words indistinct yet shaped by the rhythm of labor. The air here was colder, damp with the smell of rope, wood, and tar. In the wealthier areas, the last hansom cabs deposited late visitors at tall front doors, the sound of knocker on wood briefly waking the stillness of the street. Footmen answered promptly, their silhouettes framed in the doorway before the door closed again, leaving only the night. In quieter squares, the gas lamps stood over empty pavements, their glow falling on bare branches and rotoroon railings. By the time the city's great clocks announced 2 in the morning, much of London had settled into its truest nocturnal state, a blend of rest and ceaseless motion. Behind closed curtains, most households slept, their dreams uninterrupted by the faint noises beyond. But in the streets, on the river, and in the countless hidden rooms where work continued, the night remained alive, its pulse steady and enduring. This was life between the shadows, a city not entirely awake, yet never fully at rest, carrying itself through the dark hours with the quiet assurance that morning would come. By the time the bells of St. Paul's had rung out the hour past midnight, the Thames lay under a sheet of darkness, broken only by the faint ripples of moonlight. The great city was quieter now, but it was a deceptive quiet. In the deeper alleys of Southwark, narrow courts off Drury Lane, and the cluttered streets of Whitechapel, Life still beat to a rhythm that had nothing to do with the polite hours of drawing rooms, gas lamps. Though more common now than in the early decades of the century, still failed to reach into every corner. The light they cast was a peculiar sorcello, uneven and always bordered by shadow. It caught the glint of a watch chain here, the pale curve of a woman's face there, before swallowing them again into blackness. Cobblestones, slick from the damp night air, reflected these dim pools like dark mirrors. Night in Victorian London belonged as much to the invisible as to the visible. Figures moved with quick, cautious steps, hoods pulled low, hats tipped forward. Some walked with purpose, a messenger boy carrying a parcel across the city, a midwife called to an urgent birth, but many simply drifted, pulled along by the night's uncertain currents. Street hawkers, the hardiest of them, still called there, whereas even in the small hours, you might hear the faint cry of hot eels. From a corner where a battered cart steamed under the lamplight, or the soft sing-song of a muffin seller tapping his tray. The smell of frying fish clung to the air alongside that of soot, damp rope, and the sour tank of the river. But the night also carried other sounds. The clink of coins in a furtive exchange, the low murmur of negotiations in doorways, the sudden laughter that broke too sharply and too briefly to be entirely friendly. Watchmen, their long coats buttoned against the chill, moved in slow patrols, their lanterns swinging at their sides. Some were vigilant, others, less so, content to linger in doorways with acquaintances. The newly formed Metropolitan Police had brought a measure of order, yet the night retained its own rules. And beneath the main streets, in the labyrinth of courts and alleyways where light rarely penetrated, London's underclass lived much as it had for generations. Whole families slept in single, airless rooms, their windows stuffed with rags against the draught. Others found shelter in lodging houses where a penny might buy you a spot on a shared bench and tuppence a space on the floor. Outside, in shop, doorways and under railway arches, those with nothing settled in for the night, with only their coats and the thin promise of sleep to shield them. It was a world that existed alongside, yet apart from the polite city, the same moon hanging above, both but casting very different shadows. While most of the city's respectable households lay under heavy blankets, the quiet streets of London were threaded with the steady movements of those whose work began when the rest of the city slept. In the back rooms of bakeries, far from the eyes of daytime customers, pale dough was being kneaded and folded under gaslight. The air was warm and heavy with the smell of yeast, a welcome change from the damp chill outside. Bakers' boys moved quickly, dusted white from head to toe, their aprons stiff with flour. They loaded great trays into iron ovens, the heat radiating so fiercely that the glass in the windows misted over even in midwinter dot out in the streets. The night soil men went about their work, emptying the privers of homes that had not yet been connected to London's growing sewer system. It was grim, dangerous labor, done with carts and buckets, often in silence, save for the occasional clang of metal against brick. Their routes took them into the narrowest alleys and poorest districts, where the stench was part of the very air. By morning, their traces would be gone, the streets seemingly untouched. Yet the work they did kept the city livable, along the Thames. Market porters began their shifts well before the first blush of dawn. At Billingsgate, the fish market came alive in the cold hours of early morning. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies between stacks of crates, and the slap of wet fish against wooden counters echoed against the brick walls. Men in thick wool caps shouted. Prices, bargained over heaps of eels, haddock, and mackerel, their breath turning white in the air. The smell was sharp and unmistakable, carrying on the river breeze to anyone within several streets. Elsewhere, Covent Garden stirred with the rustle of produce crates being stacked. Carts arriving from the countryside laden with vegetables and fruit, horses stamped and snorted in the chill, their harnesses jingling as they waited for unloading. The market women, shawls pulled tight against their shoulders, set up their stalls by lamplight, their fingers red from the cold as they sorted apples, carrots, and greens into neat, inviting piles. For others, the working night was less visible. Telegraph clerks, station porters, lamplighters, and railway switchmen kept the machinery of the city turning through the hours most Londoners never saw. A letter sent late in the evening might be sorted, stamped, and already on its way to Scotland, before its sender had risen from bed. A train leaving Paddington under the cover of night would carry goods and passengers far from the city before the first morning papers hit the stands. The working night was not glamorous, and it did not often earn its laborers the admiration of polite society, yet without it, the daylight hours would falter. It was the unseen engine, the quiet hum beneath the roar of the waking city. The gas lamps burned in orderly lines down London's main thoroughfares, but between them lay long stretches of shadow where the darkness seemed to have weight. In those places, the watchers moved, not always seen, but always aware. The Metropolitan Police, still a relatively new institution in Victorian life, kept their beat in pairs or alone, depending on the district. Their blue uniforms and tall helmets marked them out, their polished truncheons hanging at the ready. The sound of their boots on the pavement was slow and deliberate, meant to signal presence as much as authority. They passed doorways where figures lingered in silence, past shuttered shops whose proprietors trusted them to deter any trouble. From time to time, an officer might stop to exchange a quiet word with a night watchman guarding a warehouse or a yard, comparing notes about suspicious movements or the smell of smoke. Not all watchers wore the badge. Private watchmen, hired by wealthy households, kept vigil in the darker, more secluded streets of Mayfair and Belgravia. These men stood in heavy coats, armed with little more than a lantern and a stout stick, ready to escort late returning residents or to investigate the sound of breaking glass. Some were veterans of the army or navy, bringing the discipline of long service to their rounds. Others were simply strong-armed locals, known in their neighborhoods and trusted to keep order by presence alone. Then there were the wanderers, not official, not welcome in every quarter, but ever present. Cab drivers in their top hats and weather-beaten coats trundled along in their hansom cabs, searching for fares outside theaters, music halls, and railway stations. They knew the quickest routes and the back ways, knew where the gaslights failed, and where the road turned to rough cobbles. A lucky driver might find himself hired for an all-night engagement, carrying a party from one glittering supper room to another until the first hint of morning. Other wanderers moved without wheels. The costermongers, selling roasted chestnuts or pies from their handcarts, lingered outside the public houses and the music hall doors, their voices carrying cheerfully over the rumble of the street. Newspaper boys darted between puddles, offering late editions with lurid headlines, the ink still damp. But there were darker wanderers too. Petty thieves worked the unlit lanes, their movements quick and silent, hands darting to pockets or unlatched shutters. Drunken brawlers stumbled home from gin shops, sometimes under their own power, sometimes under the arm of a constable. In the poorest districts, some walked simply to keep warm, for the cost of a bed in a lodging house was more than they could pay. The city's night had its own tide, watchers keeping its order, wanderers testing its edges. They shared the same streets, moving through the same pools of light and darkness, bound together by the invisible thread of the hour. Long before the city truly woke, there were small stirrings in its veins. The deep black of the sky softened into a muted grey, and the gas lamps, still burning, seemed to lose their dominance over the streets. Their yellow light mingled with the pale hint of dawn, making the shadows less certain, the corners less deep. In the market districts, movement began earlier than anywhere else. Porters trundled carts loaded with vegetables from Covent Gardens, overnight deliveries, the air, rich with the earthy scent of cabbages, the sweet perfume of crates of oranges, and the faint spice of imported herbs. The fishmongers along Billingsgate clattered their counters into readiness, the smell of the river and the day's catch mixing in the cold air. Wooden crates thudded onto wet cobbles, and gulls wheeled overhead, calling sharply. Milkmen appeared. On the quieter streets, their carts rattling and their churns sloshing. The clink of glass bottles against one another was a familiar music to early risers. Some householders, already up, greeted them at the door. Others simply left payment on the step. Chimney sweeps gathered in small knots, their brushes slung over their shoulders, waiting for the day's work to begin. In the rail yards, steam hissed from the first trains of the morning. Porters hurried along the platforms, carrying luggage. For travelers who were intent on catching the early service to the coast or the industrial towns, telegraph boys stood ready at their stations, bicycles at hand, to carry the first wires of the day. The constables who had kept their beat through the long hours now turned toward their stations, faces drawn from the cold, uniforms damp from fog or drizzle. They exchanged a few quiet words with the day shift before heading home to rest. Night watchmen handed over keys and notes to their replacements. By the time the church bells struck 6, the city was changing in earnest. Shopkeepers swept their steps, public houses shuttered their doors after a long night's trade, and the last of the night wanderers melted away into side streets. The gas lamps were turned off one by one, and the pale sunlight, still weak but growing, claimed the streets. Night in Victorian London never truly stopped. It simply handed itself over to the day. The shadows retreated, the clamour of industry and commerce returned, and the strange intimacy of the dark hours faded, leaving behind only traces, a scuff mark on a pavement, the lingering smell of roasting chestnuts, a dropped glove in the gutter. The city was awake again, and its night secrets were tucked away until darkness fell once more. When the gas lamps lit the streets of Victorian London, they revealed only part of the city. Much of what defined the night happened out of sight, behind closed shutters and heavy curtains. The private world of the night was not quieter than the streets, only different, and in some ways, more revealing than the narrow terraces of working-class districts. The night was often the only time families could gather together. After long hours in factories, workshops, or service, they came home to small rooms warmed by coal fires. Meals were plain bread, cheese, sometimes a bit of boiled meat or stew, but they were eaten with a kind of relief. Children drowsed beside the hearth, their faces lit by the flicker of flames, while parents mended clothes by lamplight or shared stories of their day. The smell of damp wool hung in the air, along with the tang of smoke that never fully left the lungs. In more prosperous homes, the evening brought a different kind of routine. parlors were bright with oil lamps and polished brass fittings. Servants moved quietly through the rooms, stoking fires, pouring tea, and laying out late suppers on silver trays. Ladies read novels or worked embroidery, gentlemen leafed through newspapers or attended to correspondence. Conversation was measured, polite, and sometimes tinged with the faint stiffness that Victorian manners demanded. Yet behind this refinement, there could be tensions and quiet dramas, small rivalries between siblings, discontent between spouses, ambitions quietly nurtured in the privacy of one's thoughts. Boarding houses, which dotted the city in great numbers, had their own particular nighttime character. Lodgers returned at different hours, bringing with them the smells of the streets, the docks, or the kitchens where they had labored. In shared dining rooms, talk was a patchwork of accents and trades: dock workers, clerks, seamstresses, and clerics, all rubbing shoulders in a kind of enforced community. Some lodgers kept to themselves, retiring early. Others lingered in conversation, exchanging scraps of gossip or news before heading upstairs to narrow, creaking beds. There were also rooms where the night was a time of solitude. The elderly widow, in her small rented flat, sitting by the fire with a Bible open on her lap. The young clerk studying late to improve his chances of promotion. The seamstress finishing work by candlelight for a client who would never know the hours that went into each stitch. In these quiet pockets of the city, the night allowed a kind of stillness that the day never could. But behind other doors, the darkness was less gentle. Some rooms were filled with the muffled sounds of arguments, of drinks-fueled quarrels that might spill out into the street. In poorer areas, walls were thin, and neighbors heard one another's lives whether they wished to or not. A slammed door in one household could set dogs barking in the alley, could jolt a baby awake to houses down. For many, night in Victorian London was not just a pause between days, but the only time when private life could unfold. And though the city outside was immense and restless, these countless small, enclosed worlds, each with its own routines, dramas, and silences, made up the true fabric of the night. While much of London's nighttime life hid itself in quiet rooms, there were other spaces where sleep was a rare luxury, places where the work of the city continued long after most households had gone still. In the cramped back rooms of bakeries, heat rolled from brick ovens as men and boys worked, barraamed in the glow of coals. Dough was kneaded and shaped on flour-dusted tables, the steady thud of fists and the scraping of wooden paddles marking the hours before dawn. These workers often never saw the quiet streets at midnight, for their world was lit by the orange glare of fire and the drifting haze of steam. When the city finally stirred in the morning, their labor would already be done. The scent of fresh bread spilling from shop doors as they trudged home to catch a few hours rest in laundry rooms, often tucked into the lower levels of boarding houses or service wings of grand homes. Washerwomen toiled late into the night. The rhythm of the work was unending. The plunge of clothes into water, the wringing and twisting, the hiss of irons heating over coals. The air was thick with dampness, and steam curled in the lamplight. Many of these women worked for pennies, paid by the piece, and so the hours stretched on as they fought to finish. Bundles before delivery, certain trades found the darkness itself an ally. In small workshops, bootmakers and tailors sometimes worked, late to meet an urgent order, their lamps casting long shadows over neat rows of tools. The quiet of the city outside made their concentration sharper. The sound of a hammer tapping leather, or the whisper of a needle through cloths seeming louder. in the stillness. And then there were the rooms where the night meant constant vigilance. In telegraph offices and certain sections of the railway system, operators stayed at their desks through the dark hours, receiving messages that sped through the wires from distant cities or from ships at sea. For them, night was not empty, but alive with coded chatter. The clicking and tapping of signals that bound London to the wider world. In hospital wards, nurses moved quietly between beds, carrying oil lamps whose glow fell gently on pale faces. Patients in pain muttered or called out in the dark, and the soft rustle of sheets mixed with the occasional groan or the hurried footstep of a doctor summoned in the night. The hours were long, but for those who needed care, these rooms were lifelines, islands of light. In the city's private sea of darkness, there were also the rooms that never slept because they could not afford to. In the poorest corners of the East End, families sometimes shared beds in shifts, the sleepers curling up while others worked, then trading places when the new wage earner came home. For these households, night and day were simply halves of a single, continuous struggle to survive. London's nights were not only lit by the lamps of streets and drawing rooms, in bakeries, laundries, workshops, and wards. The work of the city went on behind walls, unseen by most of those who benefited from it. The people in these places rarely saw the moon over the rooftops or the glimmer of the Thames under starlight, but without them, the city would have woken to emptier streets, bare tables, and colder hearths. Behind the closed doors of Victorian London's houses and lodgings, night could bring more than rest. For many, darkness was when troubles seemed to multiply, their presence made sharper by the quiet dot in the damp, narrow rooms of the poorer districts. Illness moved silently, air thick with smoke from coal fires, and the lingering scent of unwashed clothes became a perfect breeding ground for coughs that deepened into something far more dangerous. Consumption, typhus, and other fevers thrived. In these conditions, their progress unchecked by the medicines of the day. A child might go to bed merely weak and wake before dawn in a state that had the household whispering in fear. Even in more comfortable homes, night could be a time of unease. Oil lamps and candles, though common, carried their own threat. 1. Careless movement, a curtain brushing against a flame, a candle left burning too low, could set a room alight. In a city built in large part from timber, fire spread fast. Families often kept a bucket of water near the hearth, but such measures were little comfort when flames began to climb the walls. Not all dangers came from accident. In lodging houses, where strangers often shared walls or even sleeping quarters, theft was a constant risk. A weary worker might wake to find his week's pay gone, or a seamstress discover her tools missing. The loss not just of possessions, but of the means to earn tomorrow's meal. In these places, trust was a fragile thing, and people often slept with their most precious belongings tucked under their pillow. There was also the shadow of domestic violence, seldom spoken of but painfully common. In cramped rooms where tempers were already worn thin by hardship, disputes could turn harsh under cover of night. For many women and children, evening brought not the relief of the day's end, but the dread of what might come after the door was shut. Rats, too, were unwelcome guests in countless homes. Drawn by scraps and crumbs, they moved through walls and floorboards, their scratching a constant reminder of the city's underbelly. In poorer areas, they brought more than disgust. They carried fleas and disease, an invisible thread tying the home to the dangers of the streets outside. Even silence itself could weigh heavy. In large houses, a sudden creak of the stairs, or a faint tapping at the window might be nothing at all. The woods settling, the wind shifting, yet in the minds of those awake, such noises could grow into the suggestion of something more sinister. The fear of intruders, ghosts, or the unexplainable lingered more strongly when only the dim glow of a dying fire kept the dark at bay. Night in Victorian London was never fully safe. No matter how firmly one bolted the door, the dangers might not always be visible, but they were there, woven into the very fabric of life, waiting in the quiet hours before dawn. Long before the first light touched the rooftops, Victorian London began to rouse itself. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, a faint shift in the air, a distant creak of a cartwheel, the muffled tread of boots on cobblestones. For those still awake from the night before, these sounds were a reminder that the city never truly slept. It only changed its face in the docklands. The earliest stirrings belonged to the porters and lightermen, already at their work before. The sun had a chance to rise. Their breath rose in pale clouds as they shouted greetings across the wharf. Ropes slapped against the sides of moored barges, and the air filled with the briny tank of the river mixed with the sharper scent of coal smoke in the markets. Traders began to appear, their stalls not yet set, but their voices already filling the gloom. Wooden barrows rattled over cobblestones, laden with vegetables, fish, or bolts of cloth. Lanterns swung from hooks, casting patches of light that wavered like islands in a sea of shadow. Cats slinked between baskets, their eyes catching the glow as they hunted for scraps from the previous day. In the narrow alleys, the night's mall, desperate figures began to fade away, vanishing into lodging houses or retreating into the deeper shadows before the watchful eyes of the morning crowd arrived. The casual dangers of darkness gave way to the ordered hazards of the day. Factory whistles, speeding cabs, and the relentless press of human life. Chimney sweeps, often no more than boys, were among the first to be sent out, their faces and small, wiry frames moving briskly toward the houses they would work in. Milkmaids balancing pails or pushing handcarts made their rounds in the chill, their footsteps marking the steady growth of morning's rhythm for those waking in fine townhouses. The sounds of daybreak were softened by thick curtains and plush carpets. Servants moved quietly through the halls, stoking fires, polishing brass, and preparing breakfast trays that would not be served for another hour or more. The city's stir was a distant hum here, faint and filtered, a background to a more measured life. Yet whether in a riverside slum or a West End terrace, the change from night to morning was a shared experience. The darkness loosened its grip. The lamps went out one by one, and the outlines of buildings emerged from the shadows. Windows reflected the first glimmers of daylight, and with them came the knowledge that another day, with all its labors, dangers, and small comforts, had begun for many. The night had been endured rather than slept through. But with the coming of morning, the city's inhabitants took their place in its ceaseless rhythm once more, as if the fears of the hours before dawn were nothing more than a passing dream.